Hello there, welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight. If you're here for something different, something strange, something that unearths the shadows of history, we're in the right place together. Before we begin, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot, and it tells the algorithm that you're ready for more long-forgotten truths that no textbook ever dared to include. And now, before we journey into the darkness behind the crown, let me ask you, where are you listening from tonight? What city, what country, what strange and quiet place are you resting in while we pull back the curtain on what really happened behind the palace walls? Leave your answer in the comments. I love reading them, and they remind me just how many of us are still listening to the echoes of the past. All right, now close your eyes, settle in, and let's return to a reign that is remembered for glory, but built upon something far less noble. We begin not on the battlefield of Agincourt or among the fanfares of English victory, but in the cold, echoing chambers of royal silence. Because that is where the story of Henry V and his wives truly begins in silence. The silence of a marriage without joy. The silence of a crown worn like a shackle. The silence of history, which for centuries has whispered only part of the truth. We know Henry as a warrior king, as the hero of Shakespeare, as the one who united England beneath a banner of triumph. But beneath the armor, beneath the carefully crafted myth, was a man haunted not by his enemies, but by his blood. And when that blood ran cold, when the fever of war receded, what was left behind was not peace, it was scrutiny. And into that scrutiny walked his wife, Catherine of Valois, a woman remembered for little more than her lineage and her womb. But she was far more than a passive figure in the margins. She was witness, she was mirror, and eventually she became a threat, not through rebellion, not through scandal, but through her very presence, through the simple, unbearable fact that she saw him not the king, but the man. And what she saw was not glorious. In the early days, there were no beatings, no loud accusations. That would come later, from others. But there was an absence, a chilling, deliberate absence. He would leave for nights at a time, not to war, not to counsel, but to wander the corridors alone. Servants heard him muttering in Latin, praying, perhaps, or perhaps something else, something darker. Catherine once asked where he went. He didn't answer. He only looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time and not liking what he saw. Theirs was not a union built on affection. It was a transaction. France for stability, heir for power. And when the heir came too soon, too silent, something in Henry shifted. Not outwardly. He still held court, still smiled for portraits. But Catherine began to find her chambers searched, her letters read, her ladies replaced with spies. She was a queen in name only. A captive in silk. And Henry, he grew colder. Not cruel. That would be easier. But calculating. He didn't strike. He observed. He watched how long she slept, what she ate, whom she spoke to. And still, no one said a word. Because Henry was a king, and kings are not questioned. Not in public, and never in private. But Catherine was no fool. She saw the trap tightening. So she began to write, not to foreign courts, but to herself. In scraps, in code, fragments hidden in the bindings of psalters, she wrote of loneliness, of fear, of the sound Henry made when he dreamed. She wrote of a voice not his heard in the chapel at night. A voice that repeated a single phrase, "You must make her clean." And she wrote of the moment she knew, truly knew, that she would never be allowed to leave him. Not alive. But even Catherine could not foresee how quickly the facade would shatter. It began with a falcon, a gift from a Flemish noble. It died in its cage. No one could explain why. Then a maid fell ill. She claimed she had touched a scroll in Henry's study. Within days, her skin erupted in black boils. Catherine asked questions. The wrong ones. And Henry smiled, not kindly, but as a man who sees a piece falling into place. That night, he left her a rose. One rose. blackened, wilted, placed on her pillow. When she turned to ask what it meant, she found no one there, just the sound of something moving behind the walls. Not footsteps, something slower, more deliberate. And for the first time, Catherine prayed not for safety but for invisibility. Because whatever her husband had become, it no longer walked entirely alone. The castle grew colder, though it was not yet winter. Tapestries were removed without explanation. Mirrors were veiled. The queen's corridors were narrowed doors that once opened easily now groaned shut, and some did not open again. Catherine's gowns began to disappear. A lady-in-waiting swore she saw one burned in the courtyard at dusk. No one confirmed it, no one denied it. Henry, once distant, became methodical. His visits came at precise times. He would sit without speaking, without touching, eyes flicking from object to object, as though making note of what she still had. Not as a husband, as a keeper. Catherine, in her silence, began to listen, and in listening she uncovered a strange rhythm beneath the palace's life. A series of patterns, bells that rang out of schedule, a set of guards who changed posts every 13th night instead of 7th, a maid who refused to enter the north wing after dusk. She asked her why, gently, with kindness. The girl said only this: "He walks again," and then shaking, begged the queen not to ask more. Catherine did not sleep that night, nor the one after. Instead she followed, candles out, barefoot, her steps muffled beneath ancient tapestries hung across the stone floor. She moved toward the chapel, the only room left untouched, and yet deeply wrong. There, in the dark, she saw him, not Henry, not her husband, but a priest, or something dressed as one, eyes hidden beneath the hood, hands covered in ash. He stood in the pulpit whispering to no one, or perhaps to something unseen. The next day, when she tried to ask Henry if he knew of the figure, he laughed not with mirth, but with detachment, as though amused by a child's game. "There is no priest," he said, "only witnesses." She did not ask again, but the dreams began, always the same. A river, black and boiling, children weeping at its edge, a crown half submerged, and behind her, a presence, a voice repeating, "Tell no one, bury her clean." The phrase echoed across nights, and when she told her confessor, he grew pale, told her to fast, told her to pray, told her not to speak of such things in court, not if she wished to remain whole. Catherine knew then. The silence was not madness, it was design. Henry's rule, his victories, his diplomacy, his legend was not built on strength. It was built on secrets, and the greatest of them stood in that chapel, robed in darkness, whispering to something older than kings. She became ill, not visibly, but deeply. Her thoughts ran in spirals, her food tasted of copper, her skin bruised without touch. Some said it was nerves, others said witchcraft, but one old healer said nothing, just placed his palm on her belly and wept. Catherine never asked why. She no longer needed to. She had seen enough, and so she planned. Escape was impossible, but witness was power. She began to record again, but now not in scraps, in full. Each night, a candle. Each page, a confession of what she had seen, what she had heard, what she feared. She wrote of Henry's sudden disappearances, of the animal bones buried in the garden, of the song hummed by the chambermaids that matched the one from her dream. And she wrote of the ritual, the one no one spoke of, yet everyone obeyed, the offering. It happened only once a year, in spring, but when it did, the entire court turned away. Servants were dismissed, doors barred, and from the chapel came smoke, sometimes screaming, always a smell sweet at first, then rotted, then gone. Henry called it purification, said it kept England safe, said it kept her safe, and then he'd place his hand on her stomach and smile. A smile without warmth, a smile without end. Catherine understood then that she was not a queen, she was a vessel, a container for legacy, or worse, for something else. And when she refused to participate, when she claimed to be unwell, he did not strike. He did not shout. He simply turned, And 3 days later, her favorite lady-in-waiting was found drowned in the fountain, her mouth filled with rose petals, and Catherine never said no again. Not to the ritual, not to the silence, not even to the voice that began whispering beneath her floorboards at night. She simply endured, and wrote, and waited, because she knew that her words, if preserved, would one day be read. And in that reading, the truth would bleed through. Not Henry the victor, not Henry the pious, but Henry the vessel, for something older, for something watching, for something that had once demanded gods but now settled for kings. The snow came early that year, as if summoned, not by weather, but by a decision made in silence. White covered the courtyards, blanketed the roofs, softened the groans of the palace stones as they settled under centuries of memory. Catherine stood at the window of the east wing, a part of the castle few dared to enter, and watched as crows circled not overhead but low to the ground, their black feathers carving erratic patterns in the snow. Behind her, the air was still, though a fire burned steadily in the hearth. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was listening. In the weeks following the last ritual, things changed. Henry's gaze became sharper, more deliberate. His hands, once cold, now radiated a strange warmth that made Catherine recoil, not from the heat, but from the hunger in it. When he touched her, it was not affection, it was claiming. One morning, she found red chalk symbols drawn beneath her pillow. She wiped them away with trembling fingers. That night, they returned, this time etched into the stone itself. The lady-in-waiting assigned to her chambers asked no questions, simply averted her eyes. Catherine asked who had cleaned her bedding. The girl whispered, "There is no cleaning staff assigned after sundown. Orders from His Grace." And then added, "They say the last one didn't come out. There was no record of a name, no replacement, just absence." Catherine began to mark her days not by sun or moon, but by the sounds. The scrape of iron from the cellar, the dragging of something soft but heavy across the floor above, the heartbeat not hers that seemed to pulse through the walls when she tried to sleep. She thought she might be unraveling, but then, in the dead of night, she heard it laughter. Not human, not joyous, gurgling, ancient, as if something were remembering joy but had never truly felt it. She bolted upright. The hearth was cold. The candles had burned down to stumps, though she'd replaced them hours before. And on her writing desk, open to a page she hadn't touched, her journal now read in another hand. Soon, she will see. The ink was wet. She didn't scream. She couldn't. Her voice had been shrinking for weeks, like fabric soaked in scalding water. Instead, she moved through the next day as though her body had separated from her soul. She nodded when spoken to. She smiled when required. But inside, she began to crumble. Henry brought her a gift. A mirror. Tall, ornate, gold-trimmed. But the reflection was wrong. Not reversed, not distorted. Just wrong. It showed her face, but not her eyes. In their place, hollows. And behind her, always behind her, a flickering shape, like candlelight pressed into flesh. When she begged for the mirror to be removed, Henry only smiled. "It sees you," he said, "as you truly are." From then on, it stayed, covered in daylight, unveiled at night, and always, in its surface, the same figure, never moving, never gone. Henry's behavior grew more erratic. He spoke in tongues, not drunken, but ecstatic. He stopped attending Mass, claimed he had heard a better voice, and in the council chamber he demanded all oaths be rewritten, not sworn to God but to the living land. When asked what that meant, he only said, "It breathes beneath us." The court scribes stopped recording those meetings, not out of fear, but because ink, they claimed, refused to dry. Catherine received letters from other nobles' wives in distant, keeps asking if she too had felt the change. If her husband had begun to chant in sleep, if the walls bled, she did not answer. There was no one left to trust. Even the birds were gone, replaced by the circling crows, now silent, watching. One day, she dared descend into the cellar, past the kitchens, Past the unused guard rooms, down into the part of the castle where the stones sweated and the air thickened like spoiled milk. She brought no light. She wanted to see what her eyes could find on their own. The staircase ended in a door. Not wood, not metal, but bone, polished smooth, marked with glyphs she did not know, but which pulsed when she approached. Her hand moved on its own. She touched it, and it opened not by hinge, but by breath. The room beyond was not a room. It was a wound in the world. A cavity of pulsing black filled with the scent of ash and lilies. At its center, a pedestal, and upon it, a crown, not gold, not silver, not iron, flesh. And around it, 6 figures knelt, hooded, humming. When Catherine stepped forward, they raised their heads in unison, and in their eyes, nothing. Just the same hollow her mirror had shown. She ran. She did not remember how she reached her chambers, but when she did, her journal was open again. This time, the words said, "She has seen, she must choose," and beneath it, a single line, "Life or legacy." Henry visited her that night, not to speak, not to touch, just to stand and watch. She knew then that the truth would never be told in sermons. It would not be whispered in confession. It would not survive in court records. It would live only in fragments, in symbols beneath pillows, in the scent of lilies blooming where none were planted, in a queen's journal buried beneath centuries of stone, and in the bloodlines that followed. All of them touched. All of them watched. They said the king had gone mad from glory, but madness is chaotic, loud, unpredictable. What Henry became was none of that. His behavior didn't spiral, it sharpened. He no longer wandered the halls aimlessly in the night, but walked with purpose, as though retracing invisible lines no one else could see. Servants stopped looking him in the eye. Not out of fear, but out of instinct. Something ancient told them not to. Catherine knew the change had taken root when she watched him speak to the fireplace. Not to someone beside it. Not to a hallucination. To the fire itself. He asked it questions. He waited for answers. And when he received them, he wept. Not as a man lost in grief, but as a pilgrim who had finally been heard by his God. He began to fast. Not in the Christian tradition. He refused bread, but ate chalk. He drank water steeped with grave dirt. When the bishop confronted him, Henry laughed, soft and long, and whispered, "Do you still believe heaven is above?" After that, the bishop left court and never returned. The next morning, his robes were found hung from the ceiling of his quarters, twisted into a spiral too precise for suicide. And in place of his heart, a single white stone had been placed. Catherine read the report herself. It was hidden, labeled as natural causes. But the royal physician's handwriting trembled on the parchment. Henry began sleeping in the crypt, not metaphorically. Not in a different room. In the tomb of his father. Guards were forbidden to follow him. But one night, a young knight, curious or brave or foolish, crept down after dark. He didn't return. When they found him, days later, he was mute. His hair had turned white. His teeth had all been removed cleanly, no blood, and placed in a ring around the sarcophagus, like offerings. He never spoke again. Henry promoted him, gave him land, called him the Quiet One. Catherine tried to write to her family. Every letter returned unopened, sealed in wax not her own. She began to feel watched not just by eyes, but by walls. The stones listened. The tapestries moved when she wasn't looking. One night, her bed was covered in petals black roses that smelled of salt and rot. Henry arrived moments later. He kissed her hand. His lips were cold. And when he spoke, it was not with one voice but two, his own and another, lower, older, rasping beneath. "It's almost time," he said. "For what?" she whispered. "For you to see," both voices answered. That night, she dreamed of a throne not made of wood or metal, but of mouths. Open, toothless, weeping. She awoke screaming, but no sound came out. Her throat burned, her voice gone. For a week, she spoke in gestures. The royal scribes documented none of it. When it returned, her voice was different, slower, as though remembering how to form syllables. The mirror in her chamber now refused to show her at all. It showed the room, the candle, the snow behind the glass, but not her. When she stood before it, there was only the flickering shadow, shifting like something underwater. She draped it with cloth. It fell off every night. Henry began summoning children to the court. Not nobles, not orphans. Children whose names had been erased from records. He gave them rooms, toys, lessons in languages no one could recognize. They did not speak. They watched, always watching. One followed Catherine for 3 days, never speaking, just humming a song with no melody. When she finally turned and asked his name, he smiled with his eyes closed and said, "Soon I will be you," then vanished. No one remembered him. The maid swore no child had been assigned to her floor. Henry stopped holding court, stopped making proclamations. He began drawing maps, circles, symbols, dig sites, places that did not exist on any chart. And he whispered, "We're not the first." Catherine found a journal hidden beneath the altar in the chapel. Not hers, not the queen before her. Older, much older, written in ink that shimmered strangely. It spoke of a door, a gate beneath the capital, buried in history, protected by blood. It spoke of a bride, always a bride, chosen not for lineage, not for beauty, but for something else. Sensitivity, capacity, the ability to open. She dropped the journal and fled the chapel. But the next night, it was beside her bed, open to a page with her name, written centuries ago. Catherine will be the one. She burned it. The ashes rearranged themselves. The writing returned. She began to notice other women around the court, wives of dukes, sisters of councilmen showing signs, mirrors cracking, voices lost, dreams shared. They were being tested, and some failed. A countess from the southern border was found asleep forever, her body untouched, but her mouth was full of wax. Henry called it mercy. He held no funeral, just a silent dinner where no one spoke, and all the food was white. Fish, bread, milk. Catherine tried to resist. She fasted, prayed, hid in the old chapel ruins beneath the rose garden. But even there, she heard them. The whispers, the promises, the counting, always counting. 7 remain, they said. 6, 5. And she realized it wasn't days they were counting. It was brides. The last 7. The final cycle. And she was 4th. She would try to run. But where could she go? Every horse fell ill. Every map changed. Roads looped. Forests shifted. And the stars over the castle twisted into new patterns. Patterns that pulsed, that looked back, that waited. Henry watched her at dinner, not as a husband, not even as a man, as a vessel, as a door. And he smiled. The nights stretched longer now. Time no longer obeyed the sun. Candles burned for hours and still barely melted. Clocks ticked slower, and Catherine stopped aging. Not in the way legends speak of no sudden beauty, no youthful glow, just stillness. Her hair stopped shedding, her nails stopped growing, her breath no longer fogged the glass. Her maids began avoiding her room. They said it was too quiet, too heavy, as though the air refused to move. Henry, meanwhile, had begun building. Not castles, not keeps, pits. Deep and round and lined, with stone etched in symbols older than writing. He called them listening wells. He would speak into them for hours. No one knew what answered, only that when he emerged, his eyes were wet and his hands were trembling. And sometimes he smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't belong to this world. One night he invited Catherine to one of the wells. She refused. He didn't ask again. The next morning, all the roses in the garden were white, not pale, bone white, and they bled when plucked. She stopped eating. The food tasted like salt and ash. Even water burned her throat. The physician declared her healthy, but her shadow disagreed. It began to move out of sync, just slightly, just enough. When she turned, it hesitated. When she sat, it twitched. And once, just once, it looked directly at her. That night, she broke every mirror in the palace. They were replaced the next day, without her request, without her permission. She began to see symbols carved into her bed frame, in her books, beneath her skin, faint lines that pulsed on cold nights. The maids swore they saw her floating inches above the sheets, silent, still. Henry stopped sleeping altogether. He wandered the halls humming songs in languages no one had heard. Birds refused to nest near the castle. Wolves gathered at the edge of the woods, watching, never attacking, just waiting. Catherine heard their howls echo through her dreams. Always the same rhythm, the same syllables, a name, not hers, but familiar. The name she had once heard Henry whisper in sleep. She wrote it down, hid it, but the ink bled through the page, onto the table, onto the floor, and the next morning, it was carved into the stone outside her room. Henry had begun wearing only black, not out of mourning, out of preparation, as if dressing for a funeral that had not yet occurred. The court stopped questioning him, ministers nodded, bishops stayed silent, and Catherine realized they too had been touched, not possessed, aligned, shifted like stones under pressure, realigned towards something vast and unseen. Henry called it the return, and when she asked what that meant, he simply whispered, a promise. She tried to write again, letters to Rome, to France, to her sister. All were intercepted, returned. And then one day they stopped returning at all. She never heard from anyone again. Her name disappeared from records. Portraits of her were repainted. Coins that once bore her profile now showed a blank space. And in the great hall, her throne was removed. When she asked Henry where it went, he said, "You've already been seated elsewhere." She tried to find allies. The old midwife, who had once held her hand through fever, gone. The scribe who taught her Latin, hanged for heresy. The guards who spoke her native tongue, transferred. And the maid who dared bring her wine one night choked on ash the next morning. Her lungs filled with dust. Catherine screamed, but no one flinched. Screaming had become ordinary. She began to keep a journal. But each morning the pages were blank. Her handwriting erased. Her words devoured. She burned it, buried it, tossed it into the river. It always returned, unmarked, pristine, waiting. Then came the processions. Not parades, marches, silent ones. Dozens of women, veiled in black, walking through the halls at midnight. Catherine watched from her window. She asked the servants. They said no such women lived at court, but their footprints remained, muddy, wet, leading always to the crypt. And Henry began visiting that crypt more frequently, hours at a time, emerging with clay on his hands and a look that didn't belong to a man. One night, he returned with a crown made of bone. He placed it on her head and said, "Now they'll listen." She removed it. The next day, it was sewn into her pillow. The next into her dress. The next etched into her scalp, invisible but felt. Her scalp tingled when she heard his name, and bled when she tried to speak her own. She could no longer remember the sound of her mother's voice, or the smell of her childhood home, but she remembered the crypt. She remembered the steps, and she remembered the voice that now whispered beneath her skin. It had always been waiting. Henry was simply the key. She was the door, and the ritual had already begun. They said the bells rang twice the night Catherine vanished, not once for death, not once for birth, but twice for departure. The first toll was for her body, the second for everything she took with her. When they opened her chambers, the air was thick with the scent of lavender and rot. Her bed was perfectly made, her shoes placed beside it. But the floor beneath the bed was gone, not broken, gone, as if swallowed by something smooth and circular, a void etched with faint lines that pulsed when touched. Henry didn't speak for 7 days. Then, on the 8th, he summoned the court. Clad in robes stitched with silver thread, hands trembling, eyes distant, he declared her ascended. The scribes hesitated to write the word. It had no precedent, no context. But Henry insisted, and when they refused, They too vanished, each leaving behind ink-stained desks and quills still dripping. No one asked questions after that. The court resumed its functions, but the music changed. The instruments tuned lower, the hymns lengthened, and beneath every melody, there was a hum, deep, vibrating through stone, the hum that Catherine once heard in her dreams. It now filled the castle, every hallway, every chamber, even the gardens. Flowers began blooming at night. Some opened only when no one watched. One maid claimed she saw a tulip open its petals and whisper. She was sent to the coast the next morning. Her boat never reached land. Henry ordered no search. Catherine's portraits were returned but altered. Her eyes were gone, replaced with symbols, some geometric, others fluid, like ink and water. And behind her in each painting, always the well, the listening pit, a reminder, a warning. Her voice remained in the halls. Not an echo. In command. Servants obeyed it unconsciously. Ministers paused mid-sentence, as if waiting for her to finish. Henry spoke of her as if she still attended council. Catherine prefers the North Tower, he once said when asked about a renovation. The tower was sealed. No door, no stairs. Yet lights flickered in its window. Every night. Sometimes red, sometimes blue. Always pulsing. No guards were stationed there. None would stay. They said the cold was too deep, the silence too loud. Animals avoided the tower, birds flew around it, cats hissed when near, and the dogs refused to enter the courtyard at all. Henry began writing again, long scrolls of text, inked in languages no one recognized. He claimed they were translations. Of what? He never said. But once, in a fit of honesty, he whispered, "She's teaching me." The court prepared for war, though none was declared. Armies were assembled, ships built, not for conquest, for defense, against something unnamed. Catherine's name was no longer spoken in the chapel, but in the crypt her hymns were sung, by monks who bore no faces, hoods deep enough to swallow light. They chanted backwards, they walked in circles, they wept without tears. And when one was asked who they served, he replied, "The bride eternal." The church objected, letters were sent. None arrived, and those who dared ride to confront Henry turned back before crossing the bridge. They said the sky grew too quiet, that the wind refused to move, that they felt watched not by eyes but by intention. Catherine's journals resurfaced, pages now filled with diagrams and prose written in circles. No beginning, no end. When copied, the ink disappeared. When burned, the ashes rearranged themselves into her name. Not Catherine, the other one. The name she buried, the name she heard in dreams. The name Henry never dared speak aloud. She had become something else. Something ancient, not dead, not divine, remembered. And in that remembering, remade. Her story erased from books. But carved into walls. Sewn into garments. Sung in sleep. Mothers hushed their daughters at dusk, warning them not to speak to the shadows, not to listen when the well calls, not to answer. But some did, and those girls changed. Not visibly, subtly. Their laughter echoed longer. Their hair never tangled. Their footsteps left no sound. And when asked who they dreamt of, they simply said, "The bride." Henry watched this unfold with a smile. Not of joy, of surrender. He had become the messenger, the gatekeeper, the final groom. Catherine's throne reappeared in the hall, this time made of black stone. No one approached it, no one dusted it, yet it gleamed. And from it, at midnight, came the scent of lavender and rot. The ritual had worked, the bride had returned, and with her, the world began to change. Slowly, quietly, without permission. Not ruled, remembered. And what is remembered cannot die. It waits, it watches, it listens. And when the bells toll twice again, the second bride will rise. The legend of the fourth wife began with a mirror. Not a grand relic or royal heirloom, but a simple oval of polished bronze, gifted to her by a woman who never gave her name. It reflected no background, no frame, only her face. And even that, not as others saw it. Her skin looked paler, her pupils larger, her breath visible, even in warm air. Catherine of Calais, as she was known before marriage, was not meant to be queen. She was a noblewoman from the outer reaches, a scholar's daughter with more interest in stars than in silk. Henry met her during an eclipse. He arrived at her estate unannounced, claiming the sky had led him there. His men were confused. The route was not planned. No envoy had been sent. But Henry insisted, and when he saw Catherine standing in the field with her bronze mirror raised to the sky, he dismounted without ceremony and bowed. She did not return the bow. She asked why he had come. He replied, "Because you remembered me." No one understood the proposal. It came without courtship, without negotiation. He simply declared they were to be wed by the next equinox. She agreed, though her father wept. Not from pride, from dread. On their wedding day, the chapel bells rang in reverse. Musicians fainted mid-note. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of ash and rosemary. Catherine wore no veil, no jewels, only a robe of dark green, stitched with symbols that shimmered when not looked at directly. Henry kissed her hand but not her lips. When asked why, he said, "Her mouth holds names I cannot speak." From that day forward, Catherine kept the mirror beside her at all times. She consulted it before meals, before counsel, even before sleep. Servants whispered that she was not seeing herself, but something else, something behind. The Queen's chambers were redesigned according to her own maps. Windows sealed, floors altered. A central circle drawn in chalk and red thread remained untouched by even the most fastidious maids. Once, a steward crossed it by accident. He was found hours later in the wine cellar, speaking backwards and weeping blood. Catherine apologized. Not to the steward, to the circle. Her nights were spent in silence, save for 1 hour always between moonrise and midnight when she would sing. Not lullabies, not hymns, but elongated syllables with no meaning, no rhythm, that echoed too long and ended too abruptly. Those who heard it reported visions, fields of black sand, towers of bone, children with closed eyes floating above crimson lakes. Henry listened each night with a look of deep contentment. He no longer summoned counsel, no longer wrote decrees. He said, "She governs now." And when questioned, he would only nod toward the sealed doors of her chamber. One night, the castle astronomer requested an audience with the Queen. He brought with him a chart, a rare alignment of 5 planets he claimed matched an ancient prophecy. He was never seen again, but weeks later, Catherine's mirror cracked. Not shattered, cracked down the center, revealing a thread of gold beneath the bronze. She studied it for hours, then announced she was with child. The court rejoiced, a future heir, but no preparations were made. No nursery built, no midwife summoned. The Queen refused all assistance. She carried with no change in her body, no swelling, no fatigue, only a growing silence in her presence. Birds stopped singing when she passed. Dogs whimpered. Fires dimmed. And when the due date arrived, thunder rolled across a clear sky. The birth took place at dusk, behind sealed doors. No cries were heard, no blood found, only a low, vibrating hum, like the throat of a sleeping beast. Catherine emerged at dawn, holding nothing. Yet she smiled. "He's safe," she said. No one asked where. Henry ordered a feast, but no meat was served. Only fruit, roots, and water, drawn from the oldest well on the grounds. Guests who refused the menu were politely escorted out. That night, the Queen sang again. But this time, others' joy led her. From the walls, from the mirrors, from the stones themselves. And the hum grew deeper, stronger, until chandeliers shook, until wine soured, until sleep fled every chamber. When the bishop attempted to intervene, citing blasphemy, he was struck blind. Catherine placed her cracked mirror in his hands. "Now you'll see what's left," she said, and he did. Or so he screamed, until his voice failed. Then silence returned. Not peace, not comfort, just silence. Henry spoke less with each passing day. His hair whitened, his hands trembled, but his gaze remained fixed on her. He began wearing robes like hers. Speaking in her rhythms, he said, "We were always meant to be halves." But others began to disagree. Ministers fled. Priests resigned. Even loyal knights resigned their oaths. They said the queen's gaze burned too long, that her eyes no longer blinked, that she knew thoughts not yet spoken. She did not deny it. When asked what she was, she replied, "Prepared." Her mirror's crack widened. Light spilled from it, then smoke, then whispers. The court could not contain her, nor could Henry. He had become a vessel, not possessed, chosen. And as Catherine walked the halls barefoot, humming to walls that now answered, the castle itself changed. Corridors shifted, rooms vanished. New chambers appeared filled with stars that moved against their will. And in the great hall, her circle of chalk and thread expanded, consumed the floor, became a map, not of land, of memory, of time. And there, at its center, lay the golden thread gleaming, pulsing, alive. By the end of her 3rd year on the throne, Catherine's presence was no longer treated as royalty, it was reverence. Not the kind born of duty or lineage, but something older, more instinctive, like the hush that falls before a storm. When she entered a room, even the bravest knights lowered their eyes, not from respect, but from self-preservation. The queen had ceased using doors. She appeared where needed. The sound that accompanied her was not footsteps, but the faint click of metal on stone, as if chains were dragged gently behind her, though none were seen. Her cracked mirror now rested in a frame of bone carved not by human hands, but by something else. It no longer showed reflections, only possibilities. Those who dared look into it were changed. Some aged a decade in minutes. Others wept until blood filled their sockets. Still others smiled and never spoke again. Henry, ever at her side, spoke less each day. His voice had acquired an echo, even in open fields. When he spoke her name, it came in layers: Catherine, Cathara, Kethra, all spoken at once, like overlapping chants. His skin grew translucent in places, light passed through his hands. His sleep was no longer rest, but communion. He said, "She brings me where I was." Attempts to counsel him failed. Those who raised objections found themselves unable to speak of her. Their tongues stuck to their teeth. Their dreams became tunnels filled with violet light and reversed birdsong. Parliament was dissolved, not by decree but by absence. Men forgot how to gather. The walls of the hall cracked in the pattern of her sigils. Her circle in the grand hall now pulsed. It was no longer chalk. It breathed. It bled. It whispered to those who passed too close. The queen no longer ate in public. When she did dine, it was alone, seated on a throne made of roots pulled from beneath the chapel itself. Her meals consisted of petals, coal, and glass ground to dust. She chewed slowly, with her eyes closed, as if savoring centuries. Henry watched her, never blinking. He claimed she was feeding not herself, but the boundary. And that boundary, once thin and silent, had grown thick and loud. Nights were no longer quiet. The castle sang with her. Stones vibrated. Curtains moved against sealed windows. Fireplaces ignited with no spark. And the air, always thick with rosemary and wet earth, now held the scent of iron and burnt feathers. Animals fled. Birds no longer nested. The royal hounds whimpered and hid. Only moths remained, dozens, hundreds, gray with eyes on their wings, covering the walls of her chambers like a moving tapestry. One morning, the moat turned black. Not mud, not poison, something thicker. It reflected nothing. Those who drank from it said they heard voices, not warnings, but invitations. The royal physician, desperate to understand, approached Catherine with a scroll. Ancient symbols. Forgotten language. She glanced at it once, then burned it with her gaze alone. The physician vanished. His study locked itself. Inside, the pages wrote themselves for days afterward. Catherine did not mourn, she said. He was returned to question. When Henry's sister arrived, hoping to reason with her brother, she was granted an audience. But the chamber in which they met vanished for a full week. When it returned, its walls were covered in handprints, some massive, others childlike. Henry's sister emerged barefoot, her mouth stitched with gold thread. She could not speak, but she knelt at Catherine's feet, hands outstretched as if begging for the silence to continue. Catherine blessed her not with touch, but with a single word: remain. And she did, motionless, for the rest of her days. She became known as the Statue Sister. Tourists in later centuries would think her a monument, but her skin remained warm, her eyes moved. She simply chose stillness. Henry, now fully transformed, no longer held court. His duties were absorbed by the circle. Messages were given through dreams. Decrees etched themselves into bark, onto rain, into ash. The people did not rebel. They forgot how. The idea of rebellion was like trying to remember a language never learned. Her influence spread beyond borders. Ships altered course unbidden. Maps changed without being touched. Even time-bent clocks ticked in reverse. Years became seasons, memories bled into prophecy. And Catherine remained constant, her body unchanged. Her voice the same low hum that unraveled meaning. Some say she was not human, that she was sent, summoned, or awakened. Others say she was the consequence of too much silence, of centuries of queens buried unnamed, unwept. That Catherine was all of them. That the mirror was not a mirror, but a mouth, and it had finally spoken. But those closest knew better. Catherine was not the voice, she was the ear. And the gods, if they were gods, had chosen her to listen. One night, the castle vanished. Not collapsed, vanished. In its place, a field of wild lavender grew, thick and endless. Swaying to a wind no one felt. Where the circle had been, a single moth remained, larger than a hawk, wings curled in rest, and beside it, a mirror, cracked, glowing faintly, waiting. The decades that followed the disappearance of the castle were not marked by grief, but by confusion. People remembered Catherine, but not clearly. Her name was spoken with hesitation, as if it tasted strange on the tongue. Some recalled a queen, others a storm. A few claimed she was a melody once heard in a dream, so beautiful it made them cry upon waking. The field where the castle once stood became known as the Lavender Hold. Pilgrims came, not to pray, but to listen. At night, the moth would rise, only a few feet, never flying. Just lifting, wings trembling as if stirred by memory. And in that hum, those who listened swore they heard answers, not words. Something older, shapes and sound. Meanwhile, the cracked mirror remained untouched. It never fogged, never cracked further, never shifted. Children born near it never cried. Instead, they stared deep, unblinking, as if remembering a life they hadn't yet lived. Those children grew different. Not smarter, not stranger, just quieter. They asked few questions. But when they did, they were always about endings. In the absence of Henry, the realm did not fall. It restructured. A silent council governed through parchment that arrived without messengers. Edicts in ink that shimmered only under moonlight. Armies disbanded. Wars ceased. Coin lost meaning. Barter returned. Dreams became currency. Markets began exchanging not goods, but experiences borrowed memories. Fragments of feelings. There were no executions. Justice became recognition. If you wronged someone, you were made to relive their pain. Not metaphorically, viscerally, through dreams that pressed like weights on your chest, for nights, weeks, until you wept in public and were forgiven. Those who resisted disappeared, not by force, by forgetting. Their names faded. Their footprints vanished. Their homes collapsed inward, like sighs. Catherine's sisters, though none recalled their names, began appearing in portraits from villages she'd never visited, always in the background, never full-faced. Observing, sometimes smiling, sometimes not. No artist claimed to have painted them. The paint refused to dry. Animals would not enter rooms where the paintings hung. Churches lost congregations, not from disbelief, from saturation. People began finding God in puddles, in shadows, in laughter. Faith unraveled not into absence, but into abundance, and still, Catherine remained unnamed in most records. Official histories called her the Resonance, a footnote in some, a warning in others. But in oral traditions, in whispered songs and lullabies, she was the one who listened so the gods would not scream. Generations passed. One evening, a girl born under the waning crescent approached the mirror. She was 7. Her parents were simple farmers, unaware of the mirror's power. She touched it. The crack healed. The moth spread its wings, not wide, just slightly, as if acknowledging something. That night, the lavender turned white. All of it, from horizon to horizon. White lavender. No one slept. Not out of fear, out of anticipation. The next morning, the girl spoke. One sentence. "It is not over." Then silence. She would not speak again until her 13th birthday, when she sang a song no one had taught her. In that moment, every bell in the kingdom rang once. Only once, but perfectly synchronized. Even those broken or buried. A resonance. Then quiet. She grew without incident. Her presence calmed storms. Flames bent away from her. Wolves approached and lay at her feet. People did not worship her. They couldn't. She refused reverence. But they watched. Closely, hoping. On her 21st birthday, she returned to the field. Alone. No one followed, not even the birds. She entered the circle. The moth flew for the first time. Straight upward, until it became a speck. Then gone. She sat cross-legged, touched the earth, whispered, and the field responded. It sank, gently, creating a basin. A great earthen bowl. Inside it, water rose, clear, reflective, not a mirror. Something deeper. A listening pool. The girl vanished. Not bodily. She dissolved into light. Not bright. Soft. Warm. Familiar. That light settled on the water and remained. The people did not mourn. They knelt and listened. For in that pool, on quiet nights, when the wind stilled and the stars blinked slowly, they heard her. Not words. Music. Laughter. Memory. Echoes of a queen who once listened so deeply she became the silence. And Henry? Some say he still walks the edges of the field, a figure seen only in the periphery. Others believe he became the soil itself, the roots, the foundation. That his love twisted, broken, surrendered was not destroyed, but repurposed. That the gods took his devotion and turned it into ground, so that Catherine might rise again and again through others, through dreams, through stories told around low fires. And so she does. Not as queen, not as witch, as the hum beneath choice, the pull toward listening. The reminder that some truths do not shout. They wait, patient, terrifying, beautiful. The morning after the girl vanished into light, the pool remained still. No ripples, no insects, no reflections. Those who approached it swore it wasn't water. It looked like water, but it didn't behave like it. Stones didn't sink. They hovered just beneath the surface. Wind didn't disturb it. Rain rolled off its edges as though the liquid rejected contact. It became known as the listening basin. Pilgrims came not to see, but to unburden. They would sit by its edge and speak softly, not prayers, not demands, just fragments, regret, longing, names they were ashamed to still remember. Then they would leave. No answer, but always lighter. And those who tried to collect the water, their vessels would return dry. The basin refused capture. It listened, but it would not be owned. The story of Henry's wives, once forgotten, began resurfacing not in scrolls or chronicles, but in dreams shared by strangers. Women from opposite ends of the realm would wake with the same memory. A stone corridor, damp with moss, where a woman in white walked barefoot, holding a candle that never flickered. Her eyes were always closed, but she never stumbled. She whispered names as she passed, not of kings, of daughters, names never recorded, girls born in secret, hidden, smuggled, saved. And in these dreams, the women who witnessed her felt a weight lift from their backs as if something ancient and wrong had been carried for too long, and then dropped. Henry's story began to change. Historians argued. Some claimed he died without a legacy. Others insisted he had been taken not by death, but by choice, that he had walked willingly into the earth, his crown left behind like a shed skin. The crown itself was never found. But once every decade, on the longest night of winter, a ring of frost appears in the center of the basin, perfectly circular, glinting like gold. It melts by dawn. No one touches it. Not because they're forbidden, because they understand. Some truths should not be held. They should be remembered. Catherine's sisters returned not as rulers, but as weavers. They appeared in villages, spinning thread not from wool, but from memory. They would sit at looms, eyes closed, and hum. The cloth tea, hay produced, shimmered strangely. When worn, people claimed to hear things. A lover's last words, a mother's laugh, the moment of their own birth. Not everyone could wear it. For some, the weight was too much. The garments would fall apart in their hands, threads dissolving into mist. Others wore them only once, then burned them grateful, overwhelmed, changed. The sisters never sold the cloth. They gave it, always to those who didn't ask. And then they would leave, leaving no footprints. Their names changed with every town, but their eyes remained the same, ancient, patient, kind, and somewhere, deep beneath the basin, something listened. It pulsed, not menacingly, like breath, like waiting, as if the gods themselves had placed their ear against the underside of the world, hoping to hear a whisper of humanity that wasn't rage, that wasn't demand, that was simply remembering. Meanwhile, a forest grew around the basin, not planted, sprouted. Overnight, trees no one could name, bark that felt like skin, leaves that sang in windless air. Birds nested there, but never sang. Instead, their feathers shimmered with symbols, runes that changed daily. Scholars camped at the edges, desperate to decode. None succeeded. The symbols weren't language. They were emotion made visible. And the forest shifted, not grew. Shifted, paths changed, clearings vanished. One day, a scholar entered and never returned. Decades later, her daughter found her journal on the forest edge, pristine, wrapped in white cloth. Inside, only one sentence: I was wrong about everything except the silence. That silence became sacred, not absence. Presence without intrusion, and from it people began to change. Not quickly, not drastically, just slower, softer. Festivals became quieter. Music returned to breath, to rustling leaves, to the way a lover says your name when they think you're asleep. Marriage changed. It became less about vows, more about listening. Before a union, couples would visit the basin, not to ask for blessing, to speak secrets, things they hadn't told anyone, fears, shames, joys they couldn't explain. They would speak, then leave. No ceremony. And if they still wished to marry after that, they did. No rings, no feasts. Just a thread tied between wrists, cloth woven by strangers with eyes like mirrors. And so, Henry's legacy, once thought to be conquest, was rewritten, not as atonement, as warning, as invitation, to listen, to unravel, to remake, not from power, from presence. Because sometimes the most terrifying truth isn't what was done, it's what we ignored while it was happening. And in the basin's reflection, for those willing to look long enough, that truth still waits, not to condemn, to be acknowledged. At first, the records were believed to be fakes. A trunk, unearthed beneath a collapsed chapel in Wiltshire, held them pages wrapped in linen, sealed with wax that bore no royal crest, only a pressed thumbprint. The ink had faded, but not completely. It was not written by Henry, nor by a chronicler, but by one of the women. She never named herself, But she wrote like someone who knew time was not on her side. Her words were not accusations, they were observations. She wrote about silence, the kind that forms when a man speaks, and everyone listens, even when what he says is wrong. She described the walls of the castle, not their thickness, but their emptiness. How you could scream, and your voice would not echo. Not because of distance, because the walls had learned to swallow pain. The most chilling entry described a dinner, one where Henry sat in silence while his wife played the lute. The melody was soft, a lullaby, one she'd learned from her mother. Henry asked her to play it again, and again, and again. Each time, slower, softer, until her fingers trembled and bled, and then he stood, kissed her forehead, and left the room. No praise, no anger, just a departure, as though he'd never been there at all. The woman wrote that afterward, she washed her hands in rose water, not to clean, but to remember that her body still felt something warm. The journal ended abruptly, but tucked beside it was a lock of hair braided with a thread of silver. Not gold, silver, a symbol of mourning, or perhaps of memory. And then the letters started arriving, centuries later, to historians, to poets, to strangers who had only once spoken aloud their curiosity about the wives. Each letter contained a different detail, a room that had never been recorded, a meal no servant recalled cooking, a phrase Henry repeated in the dark when he thought no one listened. No one belongs to no one. The phrase was etched into the underside of a ring found in a dry well near Dover. A ring too small for any of Henry's fingers, too delicate for any noble woman. It was made for a child, and suddenly questions began to rise. Not about what Henry did, but what he feared. Why the secrecy? Why the pattern? Why the erasure? A theory emerged that Henry was trying to trap time, not stop it, loop it. That he married not out of love or power but ritual. That each wife represented a season, a direction, a phase of the moon. He wasn't ruling a kingdom, he was trying to complete a circle. And each wife, once she fulfilled her role, was removed not with violence, with forgetting. Their names were rubbed from records, their portraits painted over, their belongings burned or scattered. But the land remembered. In fields where a certain flower bloomed only once every 19 years. In echoes beneath stone bridges where children claimed to hear lullabies sung in languages they'd never learned. And in dreams. Always the dreams. A woman standing on the edge of a cliff, hair braided with silver, eyes open but unseeing, whispering a single word. Wait. Wait for what? No one knew. But the word stayed. And people began to listen, not just to her, to each other. Weddings became smaller, vows simpler. I will remember you when it's easy, and when it's not. That became enough. Rings were carved from wood, danced over fire, and no one was owned. They walked beside each other, never behind, and Henry's name began to fade not from history, from importance. His deeds were studied. But the focus shifted to the women, their crafts, their letters, their laughter described by kitchen maids, their final words scribbled on scraps of linen, their stories woven into lullabies sung to children who no longer feared marriage but saw it as a place of shared silence, not the kind that swallows, the kind that holds, and still the basin waited. The frost ring appeared, the trees sang, and once, on a night when the stars disappeared completely from the sky, a woman stood beside the basin and whispered, "He wanted to be remembered, but not like this." And the water rippled. For the first time in 1,000 years, they called it the Hush Chamber, but no one ever found it. Not on any map, not in any blueprint, not even in the diaries of servants who mapped every creaking floorboard and dripping eave. And yet, legends persisted. That deep beneath Windsor Castle, beyond the wine cellars and the crypts of kings, there was a room with no echo, a room where sound simply ceased, not because of thick walls, but because of something older, something that fed on confession. The Hush Chamber, according to whispers, was where Henry V brought his wives, not all of them, not at once, but one by one, just before the turning point, the moment when affection twisted into ritual. It was not a torture chamber. There were no chains, no blood, no broken bones. It was worse. It was a room where time unraveled, where a wife could walk in with hope, with curiosity, and walk out changed, not visibly, but subtly. Her laughter became softer, her gaze more distant, her touch hesitant, and always, she began to speak in riddles, the same words, no matter the wife. The stars aren't looking tonight. He wears a crown, but not on his head. The silver braid tightens. Servants learned not to respond. They averted their eyes, called it exhaustion. But one handmaiden, who had served 3 of Henry's wives and survived, claimed she followed one of them, watched as the queen descended the stairwell none dared tread, said she heard singing, not melodic, circular, a chant that folded in on itself, words without beginning or end. And then silence, not just in the room, in the castle. For 1 hour, not a single bell rang, not a shoe clicked, not a page turned. The world, she said, inhaled and never exhaled. When it did, the queen returned, smiling, empty. Her letters changed after that. She no longer wrote to her family, only to herself. Pages and pages of reflections addressed to the woman I was. And on the day of her disappearance, a single note remained. He told me what the gods want, and now I remember. No one knew what it meant, but then the sculptures began to shift. Stone faces in the gardens, long believed to be pagan relics, now bore features eerily similar to the wives. One by one, tourists and scholars noticed. A nose here, a dimple there, a particular tilt of the head. The statues weren't generic, they were memorials, not commissioned, transformed. And in one of them, a small crack revealed something horrifying, a tooth, human, preserved, embedded in the stone. Analysis dated it to the 15th century, female, malnutrition present, as if she had not been killed, but absorbed. And suddenly, the idea of the hush chamber became plausible, that it was not a room, but a threshold, a space between the physical and the symbolic, a place where Henry did not destroy his wives he offered them, to something older than the throne, older than England, a hunger that demanded presence, not pain, and he fed it with identity, with memory, with names. He preserved their beauty, their posture, but stole their stories, made them part of the land, the decor, the myth. And it worked, because for centuries we remembered Henry. Not them, but the statues remained, and in certain moonlight people say they move, just slightly, as if breathing stone, as if remembering. And the chant low, circular, has returned, not in castles, in dreams, in forests, in the hush before a vow is spoken. A warning, perhaps, or a calling, that the silence is not absence, it is attention. And those who walk toward it, thinking themselves kings, may find that crowns are heavy not with jewels, but with judgment. And no hush lasts forever. Some echo, even if it takes centuries. They said Henry V was a warrior king, a conqueror of France, a man forged on the battlefield. But in the silence of his private life, something darker brewed, something not sung by minstrels or inked in the margins of noble chronicles. His legend grew tall on victories like Agincourt, but what grew quietly, like ivy on stone, was the mystery of his marriages. Officially, he had only one wife, Catherine of Valois, daughter of the mad French king, and their union was supposed to be a treaty, a bridge between bloodlines. But hidden beneath that diplomatic marriage were secrets, ones the royal court never discussed openly, whispers of other women, of trials that never reached parchment, of vows made in private, then revoked under strange circumstances. In one tale, relayed only in a letter tucked between the pages of a monk's psalter, a woman named Alice de Carnac claimed to have been secretly wed to Henry long before Catherine. She was a minor noblewoman from Kent, sent to court as a lady-in-waiting, and according to the letter, She vanished just weeks after a supposed private ceremony in a garden chapel that no longer exists. The monk's letter wasn't romantic. It was terrified. He spoke of strange chanting at night, of candles that relit themselves, of birds that flew backward at dawn, and of a king who walked the hallways barefoot, whispering names that were not his own. Another record, found in the ruins of a manor outside Bristol, described a woman named Gisela, who claimed to be Henry's bride. Her diary survived the fire that consumed the estate, though no one knows how. In it, she wrote of a marriage of sleep, where she was told each night she had wed him, but awoke with no memory. She wrote of bruises in the shape of crowns, of voices in the walls, and of a silver goblet always full that she was forced to drink from. The ink in the diary grew messier, her sentences more fragmented, until the final entry simply read, "He said I was only dreaming, but then I bled." She was never seen again. And yet the records of Henry's court make no mention of scandal, no trials, no accusations, only perfect order. But this perfection was enforced with strange rigor. Servants rotated weekly, never serving more than 7 days in his private chambers. Flowers were replaced daily, but never roses, and no mirrors were allowed on the upper floor. When asked, one steward simply said, "He doesn't like seeing what looks back." The most disturbing tale emerged from a village called Elswich, where an old woman named Morwenna swore she once carried Henry's child. She was a healer summoned to court to tend to a falcon with a broken wing, but claimed she stayed 3 months longer than anyone knew. When questioned, she spoke of nights where Henry visited in cloaks stitched with human hair, of conversations where he repeated her words back before she spoke them, of a pregnancy that ended in screams not hers but the child's before it ever breathed. She kept a bundle wrapped in linen, claiming it was the child's swaddling cloth. But when unwrapped, it held only teeth. Not baby teeth, adult, yellowed, with roots too long. The village burned 3 years later in a mysterious blaze, no survivors. The official story is still that Henry V was a faithful husband, a king who died young and nobly. But these stories, fragmented, buried, whispered, suggest a different truth. That behind the throne sat something ancient. Something that fed not on rebellion or treason, but on intimacy. That to marry Henry was to cross a threshold, not into royalty, but into erasure. And not all erasures are silent. Some echo in stone, in broken journals, in dreams that do not belong to the dreamer. And the deeper one digs, the more one finds that history's most horrifying truths wear the gentlest masks. The smile of a bride, the vow of a king, the silence of a sealed chamber, and the question that still lingers, who were they, really? The women not named in history, the wives not counted, the voices not heard. They say ghosts do not rest until named. But what if their names were taken before they died? Henry V's rule was short but saturated with shadows, and as more strange accounts surface from forgotten corners of England, it becomes harder to deny that something was deeply wrong behind the banners and armor. While official records praise his discipline, his stoicism, his loyalty to duty and God, what drips through the cracks of his reign is not treason or war crimes, but something far more personal. Something intimate and invasive, a pattern of women brought close, only to vanish, break, or become unrecognizable. A sealed manuscript from the Winchester Priory, recovered after a floor collapsed beneath a chapel in 1891, revealed a litany of names: Marjorie, Eluned, Bess, Thea, each followed by notes written in a tight, slanted Latin hand, taken by night, returned with silence, refused to speak, eyes wrong. The margins were filled with sketches, rings, braids of hair, the outline of a cradle. One figure was drawn repeatedly, a crowned man with a jagged mark instead of a mouth. It appeared on over 40 pages. The scribe never identified himself. Other monastic records reference the king's special prayers, rites requested in secrecy, not in the cathedral, but in caves or empty ossuaries beneath abbeys. One monk at Glastonbury recorded that Henry visited alone during a blood moon, asking only for candles, water, and a knife. When the monk returned at dawn, The floor was blackened with ash, and every rat in the crypt had died. The king emerged barefoot, whispering, "She's still not clean." He offered no explanation. There were no further visits. Nobles never asked. They never dared. But servants did. Whispered. Wondered. One spoke of a locked room in every royal residence, a chamber never opened except under cloak of night, guarded not by soldiers but by silence. No one heard anything, but animals refused to pass near the door. Dogs whimpered. Cats hissed. Horses reared. And once, in a spring storm, lightning struck the building, cracking the stones of the room's exterior wall. No one repaired it. Instead, ivy was planted, grown quickly, trained to cover the wound. When Queen Catherine arrived, many believed the old patterns would stop, that with a political marriage came stability, normality. But things changed in stranger ways. Catherine was housed separately for long periods, officially for her delicate health, though letters from her attendants tell a different story. One wrote, "She walks at night, barefoot in frost, speaking French to shadows." Another recorded, "She touched the mirror and said, 'He sees me.' Then we found her hands bleeding." These accounts were suppressed, edited, then dismissed as hysteria. But they matched older testimonies. A nun in York who claimed to see royal women covered in ash, carrying candles that weep, was tried for blasphemy. Her punishment was light 10 years in isolation. But she died in year 2. Of what? The records say internal combustion. No explanation, no body. Another entry comes from a mapmaker named Percival Gray, who was hired to sketch the new royal gardens in 1421. He completed the work, but left behind a private journal in which he described being shown a tree unlike any he had seen, its bark pale as bone, leaves dry as parchment, and fruit that looked like mouths. He asked if it had a name. The gardener replied, "This is where he asks their forgiveness." Later that week, Gray disappeared. His wife said he went blind overnight, screaming, "She told me her name. I shouldn't have asked." Catherine's final letters, discovered centuries later in a chest beneath a ruined monastery, were written in code, deciphered only partially. One reads, "He says I remind him of the others, but I don't know their names. He says I will." Another simply repeats the word sister dozens of times, followed by the phrase, "He sees through me." The last letter ends mid-sentence, "If I do not return from the Red Room," and then nothing. Red Room, not a place known to historians. But folklore across England speaks of Red Rooms, places where wrong things happen, where time bends, where names vanish. In Suffolk, the tale of the Crimson Bride tells of a woman who wed a shadow in a crown and was found a week later with no face, only smooth skin where her features had been. Her gown, they say, dripped petals, not blood, and her ring was still warm. Chilkan sang songs about her for decades. No one realized the dates matched Henry's reign. Historians will tell you Henry V was a good king, a tragic one. But tragedy implies accident. These stories do not. They speak of pattern, repetition, design. Of a man who did not just rule a nation, but tested something beneath it, something feminine, eternal, and unnamed. And each test left behind a scar, a bride, a silence, a prayer with no ending. What did Henry V do to his wives? He married them, perhaps. But marriage in his world was not unity. It was consumption, erasure, transformation. And when the ink dries and the fire takes the last page, we are left only with the echo. She was his, but never who she was. The rituals did not stop with death. That was the cruelest revelation in the forgotten archives of monastic vaults and private estates, evidence that the king's relationship with his wives extended beyond their breath. In a sealed compartment beneath Ewell Manor, an estate once granted to a distant cousin of the crown, a leather-bound ledger was discovered in 1904 by a team cataloging noble genealogies. The cover bore no title, only a sigil, a crown, flanked by twin ravens, their wings broken. Inside were records unlike any known royal journal, One page simply read, "She weeps through stone. Her tears stain the altar." The ink was not faded but smeared, as if still damp. Another entry listed herbs in careful detail: henbane, wormwood, belladonna plants, known not just for poison, but for vision. The notation beside them, administered before entombment. Why? The body was not yet gone. The soul must be forced to see, to stay. A hidden cellar beneath the Tower of London, long sealed after a fire in the 1500s, yielded strange objects: a pair of women's gloves wrapped in blackened lace, a crown of bone tied with hair, and a jar filled with nails, each inscribed with a name. Among them, Alice, Joan, and again, Catherine. The objects were catalogued, dismissed as witchcraft or idle superstition from a darker age, but one curator noted something chilling. When the nails were removed, the room grew cold. The candles guttered, and one of the researchers reported hearing a voice say, "It was never a wedding." In the village of Kings Langley, a stone slab marks an unvisited corner of an abandoned chapel. Locals call it the Wailing Tomb. No body lies beneath it. But folklore claims a woman dressed in white walks the nearby woods, weeping blood, whispering, "He promised." Children dare each other to sleep beside it. None ever do. One boy tried in 1987. He was found at dawn, hair white, eyes wide, repeating, "I saw the room, I saw the mouth." He never spoke again. These stories do not rest easily within the frame of monarchy. They do not belong to the tidy world of succession and court. They live in the shadows that royalty casts, the hidden spaces where ceremony meets sacrifice. In one letter, unearthed in the private library of the de Courcy family, a noblewoman named Isolde writes, "The king requested my sister for service, not for marriage. He said her voice was clean. When she returned, she would not speak. She tried to bury her mouth in the earth. Later that year, Isolde vanished. Her portrait still hangs in the estate, eyes painted closed." Another account, this time from a French diplomat, speaks of a night where music played at Windsor, but no one danced. When he asked why, he was told, "The bride is not yet quiet." That same evening, the diplomat claims he saw a procession of women in red veils walk through the garden, each barefoot, each holding a black candle. He believed it a mask, until he noticed that none of them cast shadows. Catherine's supposed death is recorded as natural, gentle, but her tomb was sealed unusually fast. And during restoration in the 1800s, when the lead was removed, the interior was found scorched. Her bones showed no signs of disease, but one finger was missing, and in its place was a piece of parchment fused to the stone reading, "She spoke." No explanation, no follow-up. The record is buried in footnotes. But those who look, who dig not for glory but for truth, begin to see the shape of something larger, something deliberate, a system not of love, but of harvesting. The brides were not wives. They were vessels, chosen for voice, for purity, for silence, each one taken not to be loved, but to be altered, erased. And yet some resisted, some broke the pattern. One tale, buried in Welsh legend, speaks of a woman named Rosen, who wore no veil and bore no ring, but carried a blade carved from oak. They say she entered the king's court and sang until the walls bled. That when she was taken to the Red Chamber, she laughed, and when dawn came, the chamber was empty. The king would not speak for a month. His tongue was said to tremble. After that, no more weddings, no more brides, just silence, just war. Perhaps that was the reason for aging court. Not glory, not conquest, but forgetting, distraction, a way to drown Threave-night two-wine, echoes and blood and mud. And perhaps that's why, in the end, his reign felt so short. Because when you play with what's beneath, when you turn sacred bonds into portals, you invite things you cannot command. And they follow. Not for a year, not for a reign, but forever. What did Henry V do to his wives? He did not beat them. He did not discard them. He transformed them into echoes, into warnings, into symbols of what power becomes when it is not tethered to love but to fear. And somewhere, even now, the ivy still grows over the cracked chamber wall. The red room waits. And the bride, faceless, voiceless, endless, still walks. In the ancient manuscripts preserved not in royal archives but in forgotten priory vaults, buried beneath layers of rewritten history, there exists a thread, a pattern, that traces not merely the lives of Henry V's wives, but the purpose they served. And it is here, in this unraveling tapestry, that the horror becomes most vivid, most undeniable. For the weddings, the ceremonies, the veils, the hymns, these were not rituals of love. They were codes, encoded language passed down through whispers, never written, only sung in tones too low for comfort. The architecture of each wedding mirrored a structure long forgotten by modernity. The altar was placed facing not east toward divinity, but downward toward shadow. The bride's procession began not in daylight, but at dusk, when the first star Venus appeared. Venus, goddess of love, yes, but also of binding, of enchantment. This was not coincidence. The gowns, each seemingly white and pure, bore markings beneath the hem symbols stitched in pale ash thread, only visible when firelight flickered at the right angle. And these symbols were not Christian. They were older, Proto-Celtic, Pictish, even Coptic glyphs, languages of binding, of silence. A 1,457 inventory of Queen Catherine's possessions listed a mirror of obsidian, rimmed with jet and silver, said to show not the face, but the soul, said to crack when a lie was spoken nearby. The mirror disappeared after her death. Some believe it was taken to France. Others claim it shattered, not from a lie, but from a scream. An unholy one. In the lower crypt of Winchester Cathedral, there is a sealed door, not marked, not listed, but beneath the flagstones, an inscription reads, "Here ends the path of song. Here begins the mouth." It is thought to be unrelated to the monarchy, but a woodcut dated to Henry's reign shows a woman in robes standing before that very door, her mouth sewn shut with thorns, her eyes wide with firelight. The caption simply reads, "Sposa Ultima, the final bride." It is not just England that whispers of this. A Venetian account from 1416, penned by a merchant named Alonzo Farini, describes his visit to court. He expected grandeur, gold, feasting. What he found was silence. No laughter, no musicians, only a constant low hum from a chamber beneath the royal chapel. He asked what it was. A nobleman answered, "The voices before the crown." That night, Farini wrote, he dreamt of a bride with no skin, her face a mask of polished ivory, her hands outstretched as if to bless or choke. He left England the next morning. In Rouen, where Henry would later die, the locals still speak of the bride's hour, a time just before dawn when windows fog from within, when firewood splits without touch, when birds fall silent. They say if you listen, you can hear the bells, not wedding bells, but tolls, like funerals trying to disguise themselves. One abbess in Normandy, writing in 1421, described visions that came unbidden during morning prayers. She saw a hall filled with women in veils, each bound at the wrist with chains of ivy, and above them, a throne of bone, not human, but something older, and on it, not Henry, but something wearing him. She wrote, "The king is hollow, but within, something watches." The letter was confiscated. Her convent burned 2 years later. Officially, lightning. Unofficially, the work of fire from within. Back in England, a document known as the Bridal Charter, unsigned, unsealed, outlines a series of tests each queen was to undergo. Not public, not religious, private. The ability to remain silent for 7 nights, the strength to bleed without wound, the gift of stillness in reflection. The final test, to speak only the truth, even when alone. Many failed, and those who passed were taken, not in marriage, in offering. The term bride comes from an Old English word, bride, but deeper still, It links to the Proto-Indo-European root, brew, meaning to boil, to sacrifice, to seethe. This is not coincidence. A bride, in this context, was not a woman to be cherished. She was to be transformed, boiled down, refined, broken open. The honeymoons were not trips of love. They were periods of isolation. Each queen spent her first fortnight in a room lined with mirrors, but none reflected. The glass was silvered in such a way that it showed only the past. And in those reflections, they were forced to confront things no soul should. Their mothers weeping, their childhoods twisting, their own hands, doing things not yet done. The king did not visit, but he watched, through a slit in the wall, always covered in dark velvet. The velvet, some claim, was stitched with eyes, real ones, preserved in honey, sewn into fabric with golden thread. A guard once confessed that when he brushed against the velvet, he felt it blink. He died a week later, his tongue black, his eyes milked over. What did Henry want from his wives? Not companionship, not heirs, but something deeper. Echoes, perhaps. Reflections. Or perhaps they were doors. Each one a gate he could open, walk through, and leave behind. Some theorists suggest the king's obsession with relics. He famously collected bones, fragments of saints, cloths touched by supposed miracles was not out of piety, but practice. He was learning how to bind spirit to object, pain to permanence. And when he wed, he wasn't seeking love. He was completing a ritual, one that required consent given or taken, one that needed a witness living or dead. One that demanded silence before, during, and after. These are not the teachings of history, but they are its hauntings. And in that echoing silence, the truth grows louder. The weddings were not about love. They were about unlocking, and what was released still walks. They say history is written by the victors. But what happens when the victors erase not only their enemies, but their witnesses? The chronicles of Henry V focus on his military triumphs at Agincourt, the Treaty of Troyes, the short-lived unification of the crowns, but they whisper, if you listen closely, of something deeper, something more disturbing. In the margins of those grand victories are notes, half erased, hastily scratched over with ink, references to ceremonies not fit for clerical record. One such note, found in a damaged ledger from 1419, mentions a bridal hollowing. It is not explained. The words are circled in red, and the following page is torn out. A replica exists in the Lambeth Palace Library, but the tear is identical, as if someone wanted it removed everywhere. And then there's the peculiar habit of Henry's court to rename the brides after their marriage, not publicly, but in inner documents. Catherine became Calestis. Joan became Vestia. These names match no Christian saints, but they align uncannily with Roman and Babylonian goddesses, guardians of thresholds, of doorways, of offerings. The implication? These women were not queens, they were vessels. Between Henry's coronation and his death, there are 7 recorded comets seen over England. This was unusual, an astronomical frequency never seen before nor since in such proximity. Each comet arrived within a fortnight of a royal bridal event. Each comet was described as blood-tailed, weeping, or splintered. One court observer, a Flemish astronomer named Diederik of Bruges, claimed the third comet hovered, unmoving, for a night and a day above the chapel before the Queen's quarters. The Queen that year died, officially of fever, unofficially of silence. She was found in bed, no wounds, no marks except a circle of ash beneath her pillow. Her ladies were dismissed. No mourning was held. Her name was removed from the Book of Hours in Henry's possession. The binding of that book was said to be made from her own hair, a lock kept in wax, then layered beneath calfskin. The book disappeared after the king's death. A man named Thomas Wycliffe, a supposed monk, later wrote that he had seen it in a cellar in Calais, that it whispered when opened, that the margins bled. He never wrote again. What were these women to him? Why did they arrive radiant and disappear hollow? A priest stationed at the Tower of London in 1418 described hearing a chant at midnight from beneath the Queen's wing. The words were not Latin nor French. He transcribed them phonetically, and scholars now believe the chant shares structure with Ugaritic, a dead language spoken in ancient Syria, used only in temple rites of blood and fire. The words translate roughly to, "She is the gate. We are the wind. He is the blade." There was no wind that night, but doors slammed. Every torch went out. The priest wrote by the light of his own burning handkerchief. In a convent outside Kent, a record survives of a woman cloaked in white arriving without name, unable to speak, bearing scars shaped like crowns along her spine. She was taken in, taught to write, and her journal kept in fragments describes dreams of being split, of standing before a mirror that reflected not herself but a younger version of Henry, laughing, holding her heart in one hand, still beating. She died of fever. Her skin turned black, her tongue swollen, and on her final night, she said one word, carved into the bedpost with her fingernail: bride. Meanwhile, in Wales, an old tradition resurfaced in Henry's reign. The silent knot, a ritual binding of newlywed hands with a braided cord of wool, salt, and blood. It had died out centuries prior but returned suddenly in noble households aligned with the crown. The blood used was not always the groom's. In some cases, it was the bride's mother's. Why? To seal the loop, the documents say. A loop of lineage? Of offering? Of recurrence? No one explains, but the word recurrence shows up again and again in the king's notes. On the back of one decree, Henry scrawled a diagram, a spiral with 7 points marked B, each followed by the sign of the moon. A scholar later suggested these were phases, each bride a phase of the moon, leading to fullness and then to void. And perhaps this is the key to Henry's purpose. His rule was short, but his presence stretched wide. In paintings, he is often portrayed with eyes too bright for the room. In some tapestries, his hand reaches not for a sword, but for the air beside the bride's throat. Subtle, almost invisible. But there, the artist's initials were burned off. And in one poem written for the Queen's coronation, the phrase, "She shall not return whole," appears before being scratched out and replaced with, "She shall reign in light." Light, always light, but none of it warm. Cold torchlight, moonlight, starfire. The kind of illumination that does not comfort, but reveals. And what it revealed to those brides must have been unbearable. For in their letters, those few that survive, they speak not of Henry, but of dreams, of paths that repeat, of echoes that weep, of voices that call from beneath stone. One wrote, "I thought I married a king, I woke beside a door." Another, "He touched me not with hands, but with time." And the most chilling of all, every night I am asked a question. If I answer wrong, the stars go out. If I answer right, I vanish. What question? What test? No one knows. But in every palace where Henry slept, there is a chamber now sealed. Not by locks, but by absence. No one enters. No one dies. And when asked why, the keepers say only, "That room has no shadow." Because in truth, it never did. There is a silence that follows every great horror, not the quiet of peace, but the absence of noise left behind when something has taken all sound with it. That silence wrapped the halls of Henry's court in the final years of his rule. Not even the scribes wrote freely anymore. The royal chroniclers, once meticulous in their accounts of feasts and marriages, battles and births, began omitting names. Titles were left blank. Faces and official sketches were blurred, smeared with charcoal or torn away entirely, and the names of the women, his wives, his queens, his vessels, were replaced with symbols. A crescent, a dagger, a star with a missing point. Catherine de Valois, known to history as Henry's final queen, has no surviving letters in her own hand. None. Only a single embroidered panel, believed to be hers, found behind the altar at Westminster Abbey during restoration in 1871. The panel shows a woman standing before a mountain that weeps blood, with a crown at her feet and birds flying away behind her. Her hands are raised not in praise, not in surrender, but as if pushing something unseen away. The stitching around her wrists is tight, red thread, jagged. It does not match the rest. A forensics textile historian once said, "It looks like someone added that part later, or bled into it." And perhaps they did, for blood was everywhere in the last days of Henry's reign, not on the battlefield, but in his chambers. A servant's record, smuggled from court by a nun named Agnes of Kent, describes entering the Queen's room and finding every mirror turned to the wall, every basin filled with salt water, and a single candle burning inside a skull. The candle was said to flicker toward the floor, not upward. A wax trail led to the foot of the bed. There, beneath the mattress, was a pouch. It contained teeth, not human. The jaw of something canine, but if too many incisors. This pouch was buried, burned, and sealed beneath stone. The room was never used again. Catherine, from that day, was never seen again in public. Her official death is listed as childbirth, but no midwife signed the record. No baby was recorded. Only a line drawn through the expected page in the registry. A deep, jagged line that tore the parchment. The quill used for it was snapped and buried with the day's ashes. And what of the ashes? They were thrown into the Thames, but not before a priest claimed to see them move before he'd thrown them, as if something within them resisted drowning. Even more disturbing are the documents kept by Henry's confessor, a man named Father Benedict, who later disappeared entirely from all records. His last confession log, partially preserved in an abbey in Norfolk, is a strange and rambling piece. It does not name Henry directly. Instead, it refers to the man who wears the crown of another, and describes rituals not of sin, but of seeking. He asks me night after night if souls can be split. The priest writes, "He brings me drawings of circles within circles. He says he dreams of a ladder with no top, and he is climbing down it." One entry ends with this: "She cries, but not from pain. She cries from remembering." He says it is not her first time. There is speculation among historians that Henry's true obsession was not with legacy, nor with conquest, but with repetition. That he believed some power, ancient and buried, could be awakened through reenactment. Not of events, but of emotions. Fear, sacrifice, surrender. And that his wives were chosen not for politics, but for their lineage, their blood, their resonance. In the Book of Rituals, a now-lost text rumored to have been kept in Henry's private collection, there is said to have been a page describing echoed queens, women who are not born but remembered, found again, married not once but across lives. Catherine was thought to be one, and the ceremony conducted for her, in secret, was not a wedding, but a retrieval. There are sketches of that ceremony, illicit copies found in the diary of a court painter. They show a circle of women, veiled, holding rods carved with animal bones. At the center, a man kneels before a basin of smoke. Behind him, a woman stands with a mirror strapped to her chest. Her face is erased, but her posture matches Catherine's coronation painting. In this mirror, they believed, was the past. The real past. Not what is written, but what is felt. Henry wanted to feel it all, to remember what no one else could, and through that memory, become something more. But at what cost? His wives were not loved, they were not honored, they were not mourned. They were instruments, and when they broke or when they remembered too much, they were unmade, not killed, not buried, unmade. Their presence dissolved, their names turned to dust, and even their shadows erased. There's a corridor in Windsor Castle where no paintings hang, where no furniture sits. It leads to a sealed door. Guards stand there still, though no order exists for why. And visitors who pass through speak of feeling watched, of hearing whispers, of weeping they cannot trace. One guard in 1,932 resigned after a single shift, claiming the air in that hallway felt like regret. Another said he saw a woman in white walk backward into the wall, her mouth open in a scream with no sound. Perhaps Catherine walks still. Or perhaps it is not her at all, but what was left behind. What Henry drew out. What he fed again and again, bride after bride, until it grew stronger than him, until it no longer needed him. His death, official records say, was sudden. Dysentery. Fever. But his body was never viewed publicly. His tomb was sealed before dawn, and the bishop who anointed him was found that same night drowned in his own font. The water was black. The floor beneath it cracked, and a single phrase had been carved into the altar. She remembers now. We may never know what truly happened behind the veils and doors and silences of Henry's reign, but history remembers in echoes, in scratches, in burned pages, in erased names. And somewhere, deep beneath stone and time, those brides remember too. It begins where most stories end, with the funeral of a king, but not a funeral of mourning, nor one of celebration. It was a quiet burial, too quiet. When Henry V died, the sun did not rise for 3 days. Not literally, of course, but in the minds of the people, in the color of the sky, in the mood of the birds, in the way bells rang out, not as music, but as warnings. The court was draped in black, yet no one wept. Not publicly, not in song. Instead, servants moved with precision. Candles were replaced 3 times a day, even if they had not burned down. Food was prepared but not eaten. Doors remained open. Windows remained closed. It was as if the entire palace entered a ritual of waiting not for death, but for something that came after. And in Poe's first 3 nights, strange occurrences were recorded. The horses in the royal stables would not sleep. They faced the walls, scraped their hooves in unison, and refused food. Birds circled the tower but never landed. Milk soured within the hour. Mirrors cracked inward, as if something had pulled their reflections into a place beyond glass. And then came the whispering. Not from people. From the walls, from the wooden beams of the great hall, from the stones of the chapel floor. Guards reported hearing words not in English, not even in Latin, but in a language that felt older than both words that pressed into their skulls like pressure, not sound. And the women of the court, especially the ones who had served the late queens, began to vanish. Not all at once, not with screams or struggle. They would walk into the garden or sit beside the fountain and simply cease. No one ever found remains. Only the faint imprint of footsteps and once a silver comb tangled with a single strand of hair that shimmered like moonlight but burned the hand that touched it. The king's body was not embalmed in the usual way. The physicians insisted it was too dangerous, that the blood refused to settle, that the eyes would not close, that the heart continued a faint twitch long after death. So they wrapped him in linen soaked not with oils, but with vinegar and ash. They laid him not in the royal tomb, but in a vault beneath the floor of the old chapel, one that had not been opened in 100 years. And even then, it resisted. The stone cracked, but did not yield. 3 masons left the worksite that day with bleeding ears and no memory of why. One monk who watched said it felt like the earth itself did not want him, that it was not a burial, it was containment. They buried him without ceremony, without name. The only marker was a broken scepter laid across the door, its head replaced with a mirror that had been shattered and then fused back together. And still it was not enough. In the weeks that followed, the court began to dream. All of them. Identical dreams. Of a corridor that led nowhere. Of footsteps behind them that never stopped. Of a woman weeping without tears. And always, always the sense that someone was standing just behind their thoughts, watching. Not cruelly, but with hunger. The dreams were traced to a room, the one where Catherine had last been seen. Its door, once sealed, had opened itself. Inside, the air was cold. The walls were bare, but in the center stood a chair. And on that chair sat a book, not bound in leather, not written in ink. The pages were pale and soft, like pressed skin. The words etched as if carved with a needle. And though no one could read the language, everyone understood it. They said it told the story of the king, but not the King of England. The king of longing, the one who seeks through pain, who builds love out of fear, who wears a crown not of gold but of silence. The book disappeared the next day, or was taken. No one knows. But from then on, no one said his name aloud. Not Henry, not Rex, only he. And the queens, those whose faces had been erased, returned, not as ghosts, but as echoes, in paintings that move, in statues that bled from the eyes, in lullabies sung by children who should not have known them. And their presence changed things. Doors refused to close. Clocks ticked backward. The River Thames rose at night and retreated by dawn. And still no one spoke of it, not openly. They began to call it the remembering. Not a haunting, not a curse, but a return of what had been taken, of what had been forgotten. And in the years that followed, every bride in the royal line, every single one, was given a charm to wear. A small piece of mirror, a thread of red wool, a feather, not for luck, but for warning. Because some said that he still wandered, not his body, but the part of him that had learned to love through ruin, that had learned to reach through time, that sought not queens, but keys. Keys to open the door he had built in dreams. The door that still waits, somewhere beneath the chapel, somewhere behind the veil, somewhere in the place where the last bride wept, not because she feared him, but because she remembered. There is a painting. It does not hang in a gallery. It is not part of the royal collection. It does not even appear in the archives. But it exists, and those who have seen it do not forget it. The canvas is wide, nearly the length of a banquet table, but the image itself is narrow, claustrophobic. It depicts a woman in a red dress, standing alone in a corridor made of stone. Her back is turned, but her head is tilted, and though her face is barely visible, you can see one eye, just one, looking over her shoulder, looking directly at you. Her hands are empty, but her shadow holds something, a crown, a heart, a noose. No two viewers describe it the same way. The corridor behind her appears to stretch for miles, but if you measure the painting, it ends where her feet touch the floor. There is no corridor, only the illusion of depth, only the trick of perspective. And in the lower corner, painted so faintly you'd miss it unless you knew to look, are 5 letters. Ave he. Not Latin, not Greek, not even a word, but a sound. A whisper, a warning. The painting is attributed to no one, no signature, no date. The brushwork is precise but not classical. The style shifts as you look, Baroque in the light, Gothic in shadow, Renaissance when you blink. It is a painting that does not want to be understood. It wants to be felt, and it has been, for centuries. Every queen who has entered the palace since the death of Henry V has dreamt of that corridor. Some on their wedding night, some on the eve of coronation, some just before childbirth. They do not speak of it openly, but the diaries remain. The secret letters, the marginalia in prayer books. Always the same image, always the same fear. That the woman in the corridor is not a ghost. She is a gatekeeper, that she stands between worlds, between what was taken and what must return. And though no one knows who painted her, some believe she is the last wife, the one never named, the one erased so thoroughly that even the stones forgot her footsteps. But stones are not good at forgetting, and neither is blood. During renovations in the 1800s, workers uncovered a passage behind the Queen's chamber. Not a hallway, a gap, an intentional space. No doors, no light, no air. Just a void, lined with velvet that had rotted into dust. Inside, they found a comb, a tooth, a torn piece of parchment with the words, "He waits," written in a child's hand. The items were documented, catalogued, and then lost. But whispers returned. of a figure seen walking the garden at dusk, of a voice that spoke in the echo of the chapel bells, of mirrors fogging in rooms with no breath, and most disturbingly of brides who wept without knowing why, who stood before their husbands not with joy, not with fear, but with mourning, as if something had already been taken, as if the wedding was not the beginning, but the end. In 1923, a historian named Eliza Caro began a private study. She tracked every bride in the royal line back to the 15th century, not their marriages, their disappearances, their sudden illnesses, their retreat from public life. She found patterns, cycles, a rhythm of sorrow that pulsed every 3 generations, as if the pain needed time to rest, as if it slept, waiting. Her final paper was never published. Her notes end abruptly. A final sentence: "She is not gone. She is beneath." Eliza's body was never found, only her desk, scratched with the same 5 letters from the painting, Avièche. And from that point forward, no queen slept in the queen's chamber again. It remained sealed, not officially. The records claim renovation, maintenance, pest control, but inside, the air remains still. The candles, even unlit, grow shorter. The roses placed there do not wilt. They petrify, turn brittle and sharp like bone. And in the silence of that room, if you press your ear to the wall, you will hear not whispers, not wailing, but breath. Soft, steady, waiting. As if someone is still there. As if someone was never allowed to leave. And outside the palace, far from the court, women gather. Not in defiance, not in fear, but in remembrance. They wear veils, not white, but black. They hold mirrors, but do not look into them. They sing in a language older than England, older than kings. And they speak her name not aloud, but in rhythm, in heartbeats, in steps, in the tilt of the head and the sway of the arms. They do not believe she was a victim. They believe she was a guardian, that her silence was not submission. It was strategy, that the corridor is not a prison. It is a path, and one day it will open. One day, someone will follow her gaze. One day, someone will name her. And when they do, the palace will shake, the bells will ring, the stone will bleed. And Henry, whatever remains of him, will be known, not as a hero, not as a king, but as a lesson, a warning carved in bone, a crown made of silence, a name carried only in dreams. They say a kingdom is measured not by its battles nor by its treaties, but by how it buries its dead. And England under Henry dug shallow graves, not in earth, but in memory. The final years of Henry's reign were marked by silence, not peace, not order, but a hush that clung to the halls like smoke from a fire long extinguished. No proclamations, no public banquets. The court shrank, servants disappeared. Couriers rode with messages that never reached their destination. And in the heart of the palace, a new room was built, small, circular, windowless, lined with stone that did not match the rest of the structure, imported, volcanic, black. This chamber was not recorded on blueprints. It appears in no inventories, and yet it existed. And in its center, an altar, not for worship, for remembrance. The surface was carved with 7 names. 6 were familiar: wives, queens, lost to childbirth, to fever, to the cold blade of annulment. But the 7th name was incomplete. 3 letters. Then a deep gouge in the stone, as if the name itself had been ripped out. That chamber was sealed after Henry's death, bricked over, forgotten. But in the 1700s, during restoration efforts, the room was accidentally uncovered. The workers refused to enter. They claimed the air was too thick, that it sounded like someone was breathing just behind the wall. The room was resealed. But not before one man, a mason named Elias Horn, stole a rubbing from the altar. He copied the carvings onto parchment and took it home. 2 nights later, he vanished. His wife reported a smell: iron, smoke, and something older. His children were found asleep, unharmed, but every mirror in the house had shattered inward. The rubbing was later discovered beneath Elias's bed, folded with a note: She was not the first. She will not be the last. That parchment now resides in a private collection, studied by those who believe that Henry's reign was not merely a historical period, but a wound, one that bleeds through time. And it is here the myth turns. Because myths do not simply fade, they transform. In village stories passed down through generations, Henry's seventh wife was never truly a queen. She was a seer, a woman from the north, brought to court under mysterious circumstances. She did not speak for the first 3 months, but when she did, she spoke names. Names of those who would soon die. Names of unborn children. Names no one had uttered aloud. At first, she was kept in a separate wing, but Henry grew obsessed. He consulted her before battles, before alliances, before executions, and then, suddenly she was gone. No funeral, no notice, only a single entry in the royal ledger. Expenses silk, iron, ash. In some versions of the tale, she returned changed, hollow-eyed, with hair white as linen and lips stained red. She refused to kneel before the king, and for that, she was sealed away, not killed. Imprisoned, not in a cell, but in story, in warning. And to ensure her silence, Henry ordered a ritual, ancient, forbidden, carried out by monks whose names were struck from the abbey's records. It involved 7 steps, 7 chants, 7 nights, and at the end, a vow that no one would speak of her again, that no girl would bear her name, that no bride would follow her path. But oaths are fragile, and stories, once buried, do not rot. They ferment, they sour, they return with teeth. In 1845, a poet named Winthrop Gage published a short collection titled The Seventh Bride. It was banned within a week. Only 9 copies remain. The poem speaks of a woman made of salt and bone, of a corridor lined with mouths that do not speak, only breathe, of a crown that burns instead of gleams, and of a king who kneels, not in worship, but in apology. Gage was committed to an asylum within the year. His final diary entry reads, "She is awake, and then nothing. Silence, until now." Because silence, too, decays. And the stories of Henry's wives, those told, those withheld, have begun to breathe again. In university lecture halls, students ask about the missing records, about the unexplained gaps in lineage, about the anomalies in death certificates. In libraries, researchers compare portraits, noticing how the 7th panel in every tapestry is either damaged, faded, or replaced. In archives, the same name appears again and again, scratched out, overwritten, encoded in marginal notes. And in dreams, women across continents speak of corridors, of veils made not of lace, but of shadow, of hearts that beat, not in their chest, but beneath stone. This is not a haunting. This is a return, a reckoning, a name clawing its way back into the world. And when it is spoken, when someone dares to say it aloud without fear, the myths will fall. The truth will rise. And Henry King, warrior, reformer, tyrant, will face not judgment, but reflection. For in the end, it was not his power that endured, it was hers. It was the whisper behind the crown, the breath behind the oath, the step behind the march, the shadow behind the throne. And that shadow has grown long, longer than he ever imagined. For history is not written by the victors, it is edited by them, but it is remembered by those who dream. And she dreams still,